This smell was unmistakable. It lingered in the entranceways for years. It permeated the concrete slabs of the 9-story panel buildings. It ate into the cheap leatherette upholstery of the front doors. It penetrated clothes, hair, and went under the skin. The air smelled of anxiety. It smelled of a pharmacy and a confectionery. It was the cloyingly sweet aroma of rotting almonds mixed with acrid iodine. It was a harbinger. It was a diagnosis. Sometimes death was absurd. A person might fall out of a window while trying to hide from imaginary pursuers, or start a fire by falling asleep with a cigarette, or simply freeze to death on the street, having lost all orientation in space and time. The body, stripped of its defense mechanisms, was defenseless against any threat, real or imagined. The apartment after the marathon runner's death looked like a set for a horror movie. Mountains of trash, syringes in the carpets, and under the furniture, empty medicine packages, a persistent, unairable smell of chemicals and decay, ingrained into the wallpaper and parquet flooring. And silence, a deafening, absolute silence after months of grinding, clicking, and paranoid whispering. Parents found their children as dried-up mummies in rooms locked from the inside. They buried 25-year-old old men, not understanding at what point their smart, talented child had turned into this. They blamed the times, the country, friends, but the answer was in a small vial with a liquid as clear as a tear. The cemeteries of the late 90s and early 2000s are full of these young graves. On the faded photographs, smiling faces, taken long before the first injection. The lifespans are short, like a gunshot. 1975-1998, 1980-2001. Entire rows, entire alleys. This was a lost generation. A generation of engineers who didn't build factories, but dismantled Japanese VCRs in search of listening devices. A generation of chemists who, instead of new medicines, synthesized poison in their own kitchens. A generation that flew too high on artificial wings and burned up halfway to a sun they never saw. Vint had almost disappeared by the mid-2000s. Ephedrine-containing medications came under the strictest accounting control. It was replaced by other, even more terrible and dirty drugs. But that era left behind a deep scar on the body of society. A scar in the form of thousands of empty apartments and silent granite slabs. Sometimes, passing by an old, shabby Khrushchev-era apartment building, you can catch a phantom smell for a second. Barely perceptible, sweetish, like almond syrup, with a hint of pharmacy iodine. It is the memory of the walls, the memory of a time when the elixir of speed, the elixir of genius, the elixir of madness was brewed within these walls. And they paid for it with the only currency they had left, their own lives, coin by coin, day by day, until nothing was left, only silence, and the smell, which will never air out of the memory of those who saw it. Under a dim, flickering light bulb in the stairwell, a person was sitting. He was 22 years old. He looked 70. Parchment-like, yellowish skin was stretched tautly over his skull. His deeply sunken eyes stared at a single spot on the dirty floor. His teeth were worn down almost to the gums. His name was Vint. He was the main hero and the main executioner of a new era. An era of fallen empires and boundless deadly freedoms. It was the soundtrack of the 90s, played on exposed nerves. Time stood still. Time accelerated to inhuman limits. Everything was happening at once. The Soviet Union disappeared, leaving a vacuum in its wake. This vacuum demanded to be filled immediately. Some filled it with freedom, some with business, some with bullets. And some with chemicals cooked up in a 6-square-meter kitchen? It wasn't invented in the 90s. Its formula was known long before that. It was born in the laboratories of the Third Reich. It smelled of gunpowder and the exhaust of tank engines. It was Pervitin. Energy for the Superman. Fuel for the Blitzkrieg. Pills to suppress fear and fatigue. They were in the kit of every Luftwaffe pilot. They were in the pocket of every Wehrmacht tank crewman. They drove the army forward through Poland and France. They were called tank chocolate. They were taken by the millions. In the Soviet Union, the drug existed under the classification secret. It was stored in the arsenals of military medicine. It was used in special forces units and in aviation. But when the walls fell, the archives fell too. The secret knowledge spilled out onto the streets. It fell upon the most fertile ground. The ground of total decay and chaos. The old system collapsed. Along with it, pharmacy protocols collapsed too. In every residential district, Pandora's box was opened. Obtaining the precursors became ridiculously easy. The basis for clandestine synthesis was cheap ephedrine. It was hidden in seemingly harmless cough syrups and nose drops. Solutin, Trift. These names became passwords for an entire generation. These words were the keys to the gates of a personal hell. Pharmacies sold them without a prescription, in bulk, by the hundreds of packages. The pharmacists understood everything, but remained silent. It was business. The second key component was red phosphorus. It was scraped for hours from the strikers on matchboxes, staining the fingertips a persistent brown color. The air in the room would fill with a specific acrid dust. This was the first stage of initiation, a test of perseverance, meditative monotonous labor in anticipation of a chemical miracle. Hundreds of boxes were turned into a handful of dark red powder that smelled of sulfur. The third element was crystalline iodine. It could be bought at any pharmacy or veterinary clinic, often under a false pretext. By combining these three components, one could obtain ephedrone or mulka. But the generation of the 90s, driven by their irrepressible ingenuity, went further. They added ordinary potassium permanganate to the reaction. This was the very catalyst that turned the relatively harmless ephedrone into pure evil. This allowed for a more profound reduction of ephedrine to its older, much more powerful and terrifying brother, methamphetamine. Thus, Vint was born. The name was apt. It tightened the screws in the brain until the thread stripped. And herein lay the main diabolical trap. The first to fall into it were not street outcasts, but those who considered themselves smarter than the system. Chemistry students, unemployed engineers, young doctors, chess players, the first programmers. They saw it not as filth, but as an elegant chemical problem. They studied the formula, argued about reaction yields, and modified the process, trying to achieve maximum product purity. They believed their intellect was a guarantee of safety. They were fatally mistaken. The process controlled them from the very first drop that entered a vein. The illusion of control was the first and sweetest self-deception, one that mercilessly devoured them from the inside, leaving only an empty, scorched shell. In 1996, a single Moscow pharmacy could sell up to 500 packs of an ephedrine-containing drug in 1 hour. The pharmacists, in their white coats, understood everything, seeing the trembling hands and crazed eyes of the customers. But it was business. A kitchen in a Khrushchevka would turn into an alchemist's laboratory. Instead of retorts, there were pharmacy vials called furiki. Instead of lab equipment, there were glass flasks, rubber tubing from IV drips, pharmacy scales, and a gas burner. This act was called cooking. The cook was the main protagonist, almost a priest. The life and death of everyone present depended on his knowledge and the steadiness of his hand. One wrong move, one extra drop, and the flask could explode, turning the kitchen into a chemical crematorium. Sometimes the reaction would get out of control. The flask would overheat, and thick purple iodine vapors would fill the kitchen, escaping through the small transom window. It was a signal for the entire courtyard, a beacon seen by both neighbors and the militia. But most of the time, everyone pretended not to notice anything. Black and white. This is what they called the two types of the final product. The dirty, unpurified solution with remnants of iodine and toxic impurities, and the clean, transparent solution, as clear as an angel's tear, obtained after several stages of purification, but this tear was poisonous. The first injection was like nothing else. It wasn't the languid relaxation of heroin or the kaleidoscope of psychedelics. It was a high-voltage electric shock straight to the spinal cord, the vertical launch of a fighter jet. The world became crystal clear, and the brain, a perfect, unfeeling machine. Thoughts acquired unprecedented speed and clarity. Any task seemed achievable, any problem solvable. It was the state of a god trapped in a mortal body. In the first few hours, a person could write a thesis, develop a business plan, or simply scrub the entire apartment until it shone without feeling a drop of fatigue. The problem was that a descent always followed. The higher the ascent, the deeper and more terrifying was the abyss of the come-down, of neurotransmitter depletion. To keep from falling, one had to fly further, higher, faster. Thus began the marathon, an endless race from oneself. A marathon is a life without sleep, a day, 2, a week, sometimes more. Time ceased to exist, replaced by rigid cycles. Cooking, injection, rush, come down. Food and sleep became unnecessary, archaic bodily functions, which were nothing but annoying hindrances. The stomach refused to accept food, and the brain refused to shut down. The body did not forgive such abuse. The metabolism was the first to give out, burning to ashes in the furnace of artificial energy. The person would waste away before one's eyes, losing tens of kilograms in a matter of weeks. Fat and muscle were mercilessly burned away, leaving behind only skin, bones, and crazed eyes. Clothes hung like a sack as on a scarecrow. Then it would come. Not an animal fear, but a cold mathematical certainty that he was being watched. Icy paranoia became a second skin. The certainty that there were bugs in the walls, that operatives were standing behind the door, that every rustle in the stairwell was a signal for an assault. The enemy was everywhere, but it was impossible to see him. Consciousness narrowed to a single point, to a single obsessive idea. The person could spend hours polishing the same spoon, bringing it to a mirror-like, unearthly shine, or redraw the same letter over and over, striving for an unattainable calligraphic ideal. It was work for work's sake, a meaningless activity that devoured the remnants of reason and time. In the absolute silence of the room, there was only a single sound, the methodical dry click of a screwdriver, taking apart an Electronica VM12 VCR for the 10th time. A bug had to be hidden in its microcircuits and wires. Every part was meticulously examined, every circuit board checked for foreign elements soldered in by enemies no one had ever seen. After the VCR came the telephone, the clock, the radio receiver. By morning, the entire room was littered with dismantled electronics, tiny screws, and microcircuits. But the sought-after transmitter was never found, which meant only one thing. It was hidden even better, and the search had to continue. The enemy was smart and cunning. He was everywhere. He would stand at the door for 8 hours at a time, not taking his inflamed eye from the peephole. The distorted convex world of the stairwell turned into a shadow theater. The creak of a floorboard was the footsteps of special forces, A neighbor's fleeting shadow, the silhouette of a killer. It was a personal prison with a 180-degree view, and he was both its prisoner and its warden. His jaws clenched with inhuman force, grinding his teeth to dust. This incessant grinding, bruxism, was the background noise of self-destruction. He didn't notice the pain, only the dry friction of bone on bone, until the enamel wore down to the nerves. His mouth filled with the taste of tooth dust and blood, but it no longer mattered. The shakes would begin suddenly, like a bout of fever, a fine, exhausting tremor throughout the entire body that was impossible to calm or control. His hands shook uncontrollably, making it impossible to light a cigarette or dial a phone number. The body no longer obeyed. It lived its own agonizing life, convulsing in a silent scream from the overload. The phosphorus that gave life to Vint took it from the person. Phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. It all began with an aching pain in a tooth, dulled by another dose, and ended with the necrosis of bone tissue. The jaw would literally rot alive, turning the face into an asymmetrical mask from which pus with a characteristic garlic smell oozed. Doctors would amputate parts of the face to stop the process, but sometimes it was already too late. Sepsis would spread further, through the bloodstream. It was one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. The person rotted alive, fully conscious, his awareness clouded only by the endless marathon and pain. The veins turned into hard, knotted cords, resembling ropes. They would burn out, becoming brittle and impassable from the toxic solution and constant punctures. When no accessible vessels remained on the arms, the needles went into the legs, the groin, the neck. Each injection turned into a surgical operation, a desperate search for the last island of life. The process was called digging. In the dim light of a lamp, armed with a needle from an insulin syringe, a person could spend hours searching for a vein. The skin turned into one continuous wound, covered in bruises, hematomas, and tracks from old injections. Sometimes the needle would break off, remaining under the skin. This no longer mattered. The main thing was to get the solution into the blood at any cost. Immunity disappeared. It simply shut down, burned away by the stimulant. Any scratch could lead to sepsis. The body became covered with non-healing trophic ulcers and abscesses, especially at the injection sites. Due to the total disruption of blood circulation and the toxicity of the substance, the limbs acquired a cyanotic, deathly hue. This was the prelude to gangrene. The manganese from the potassium permanganate used for the reaction was not expelled from the body. It accumulated in the subcortical structures of the brain, causing a specific type of nervous system damage, manganic encephalopathy. The symptoms were similar to Parkinson's disease. The gait became shuffling, a cockswalk. Speech became slow and slurred. The face turned into a frozen mask. The person lost control over their facial expressions. The face would freeze in a grimace of surprise or suffering, not changing for hours. The hands and head began to make involuntary sweeping movements. This was the manganese dance, a horrific sight, evidence of the irreversible destruction of the central nervous system. The brain died before the body, turning the person into a marionette. Social ties broke one after another, like rotten threads. Friends, family, studies, work, all of it became part of a past, unreal life. The only social circle left consisted of fellow marathoners. The apartment where they once laughed and drank tea turned into a den or a flophouse, a place where they cooked, shut up, and died. During the day, the windows were tightly curtained with heavy blankets. Any ray of sunlight seemed like a sniper's blinding searchlight or the beam of an enemy scanner. The only source of light was a dim table lamp. In its yellow circle were syringes, melted spoons, cotton balls, flasks, and a scattering of empty matchboxes. The air was heavy and still. At night, the activity began. Meaningless treks through deserted streets in search of a 24-hour pharmacy or another box of matches. Paranoid phone calls at 4 in the morning. The city slept, but for them, it was full of dangers and hidden signs. Every car with its headlights off seemed like a surveillance vehicle. The economy of the den was primitive and brutal. Money was obtained by any means necessary. They sold things from the house. First the tape recorder, then the video player, then books, then clothes. When there was nothing left to sell, theft, deceit, and extortion from weeping parents began. Money existed for only one purpose: to buy components for a new cook. Memory began to fail, turning into a sieve. A week could shrink into a single day, and an hour could stretch into an eternity. A person could forget what they ate yesterday, but remember in minute detail a chemical formula or the layout of veins on a comrade's arm. The brain worked selectively, retaining only what was necessary for survival in the marathon. Psychosis was becoming the norm. Auditory and visual hallucinations ceased to be frightening. They became part of everyday reality. Conversations with invisible interlocutors in an empty room. Shadows dancing in the peripheral vision. A whisper coming from a switched-off radio receiver. The mind no longer distinguished reality from the product of a sick imagination, from paranoia. Sometimes the hallucinations took on a tactile character. The sensation of insects, worms, crawling under the skin. A person could spend hours scratching and picking at their skin in an attempt to get out the non-existent parasites, inflicting terrible wounds and introducing infection. This was another manifestation of the nervous system's total rebellion against the chemical assault. Emotions burned out completely, leaving behind a scorched desert. There was no love, no hate, no joy, no sorrow left. Only two states: a mechanical, synthetic high after an injection, and a gray, bottomless emptiness when the substance's effect wore off. Feelings demanded too much energy, which the body no longer had. When the marathon ended, due to a lack of components, the arrest or death of the cook, a personal hell would begin. This was called the come down or withdrawal. Deprived of its usual dope, the body began to rebel. Wild, gut-wrenching pain began in all the joints, along with convulsions, vomiting, and diarrhea. Every cell in the body screamed in pain. Consciousness would sink into a sticky, nightmarish sleep that brought no relief. Waking up an hour or two later, the person would find themselves in the same torture chamber of their own body. This could last for a week or two. Most couldn't endure it and would relapse into a new marathon as soon as the slightest opportunity to get the components arose. Sometimes they tried to ride out the withdrawal by tying themselves to a cast iron radiator. It was an extreme measure, an attempt to endure the withdrawal without the ability to harm oneself or get a dose. Wild, inhuman screams and moans echoed throughout the entire building's stairwell. The neighbors didn't call the police. They were used to it. They just turned up the volume on their television. This grim subculture had its own heroes and its own legends. Cooks who could get the purest product from the worst components. People who survived 10-day marathons. But all these legends ended the same way. Either with a long prison sentence or an unmarked grave. This scenario provided for no other endings. The average life expectancy of an active Vint addict was from 1 to 3 years. It wasn't even a sprint, but a jump off a cliff. The body, operating at extreme speeds, wore out with monstrous rapidity. The heart, liver, brain, everything turned to dust in a matter of months. The resting heart rate could reach 150 beats per minute. Death came in different ways, but it was always near. Overdose when the heart, worn to its limit, simply couldn't withstand another jolt. Sepsis from a dirty needle or an unsterile solution, which turned the blood to poison. Suicide at the peak of psychosis or at the very bottom of depression. Respiratory arrest during a sleep from which there was no waking up.